The smell of hot water and soaked ash in the hammam mixes with citrus rinse for hair. Steam hangs low, and on the smooth stone you can see drops of oil forming a thin film as they run into the drainage channels. Linen towels dry on a wooden rack at the entrance, next to small clay bottles with rich aromas, myrtle water for the body, infused rose for the hair, slightly sharp musk mixed with ambergris, scents not for secrecy, but for status. In city shops, people argue about hairstyles, whether to cover the forehead and ears, whether to cut the temples short, whether to leave the back of the head clean. At receptions, it is not jewelry that counts, but the shine of cleanliness. Neatly filed nails, freshly shaven cheeks, softly styled hair. Cleanliness here is not intimacy, but a form of power, like a cloak or a signet ring. The new fashion is worn as a sign of admission to the court, and it smells not of sweets, but of order. Hello, viewers, and welcome back. Please write in the comments which countries and cities you are watching this episode from. That way we can see the geography of the conversation. I wish you a calm but attentive listening experience. Next, we will discuss how grooming became a body, politics in 9th century Cordoba, why it caused a storm of moralizing, and how the city responded not with sermons, but with bathhouse regulations and tax tables. Cordoba at the emir's court lives between water and heat. Tanneries smoke along the banks of the river. The smell of tanning bark and rotting flesh travels with the wind and settles on the neighborhoods. In the markets, sore throats are treated with wine vinegar and honey. And in early spring, the city coughs as one organism. Hygiene in such conditions is not a luxury, but a necessity. Therefore, a routine appears at court, which will later be attributed to one fashionista, but in reality will be enforced by a whole network of servants, court craftsmen, and orders. Hair must be kept neat and in accordance with the season. Washing must be divided into morning and evening with different infusions. For receptions, wear fresh clothes appropriate for the season, warm fabrics in cold weather, and light fabrics in hot weather. Refrain from strong kitchen smells on audience days, so that the hall is not filled with the smell of hot food. In privileged homes, separate dishes for tooth powder and vessels with concentrated rinses appeared. Chips of fragrant wood lay next to combs. All this was not about luxury. It was about the machinery of the court, where every body had to be a clean mechanism. Thus, grooming became the language of the court. At morning receptions, not only the order of words was important, but also the order of the skin. Were there any traces of yesterday's work on the hands? Did the hair smell of smoke? Were the strands neatly arranged? The palace barbers have a position comparable to that of a scribe. They are responsible for the faces and hair of the people who will be visible at the audience. The rhythm of the street baths changes. First come those who are going to the court, then the craftsmen and merchants, and later the other adults. For women, there are separate hours and separate entrances. Everything is prescribed down to the smallest detail, so that cleanliness becomes a discipline rather than a whim. Control over counterfeit fragrances is tightened in the markets. The muhtasib checks whether rose water has been diluted or rancid fat has been mixed into perfume ointments, and the punishment for fraud is not a sermon, but a fine and confiscation of goods. Mythology likes to drag the word debauchery into this, but the document shows a simple thing: marking belonging to the circle of power through the appearance of skin and hair. The first prepared turn looks beautiful on the outside, but is harsh in essence. Traditional scholars declare overly sophisticated scents and hairstyles a threat to modesty, while city morality officials raise old complaints from artisans about the temptations of baths. Their vocabulary expresses concern for propriety, but in reality, it is a struggle for the right to set the norm. If grooming is determined by the court, then the authority of taste moves from preaching to schedules and price lists. This does not suit those who are accustomed to considering modesty the monopoly of aesthetics. Rhetorical devices come into play. Cleanliness is called splendor, grooming is called debauchery, and fragrance is called bait. But the louder the moralizing wave, the more noticeable the courtyard's response. Cleanliness is defended as civilization, not as luxury, but as self-control, which facilitates communal life. The bathhouse rules include specific hours and prohibitions on noise and drunkenness. The guards monitor order rather than hair, but this is addressed specifically to the loudmouths. Your fears will be covered by rules, not by prohibitions on water and scent. The second prepared shift is economic. Fragrances, oils, fabrics, barber's tools, and bath accessories are all taxable categories. Where the moralist sees sin, the treasurer sees duty. The city's income from bathhouses is growing. Import duties on rare resins and oils are recorded in the registers, and the servants of the court are assigned to workshops. Some can serve at receptions, some have access to special infusions, and some can only work in the markets. Thus, modesty becomes not only etiquette, but also economics. Modest fabrics of a certain cut and color are given preference in court procurement lists, while ostentatious variegation proves disadvantageous because it is not allowed in the halls. In place of the old myth that the East is synonymous with debauchery, a new reality emerges. Grooming as a discipline, paid for by the bill and regulated by city books. Hygiene in Cordoba is not salvation without consequences. The water is warm only in the hammam, but cold at home. In winter, many catch colds on the way back. Barbers cut excess hair, but yesterday they sharpened their pens with the same knives. Sometimes, cheap oil causes inflammation on the neck, and people treat it with bread pulp and vinegar, leaving scars. In hospitals near bathhouses, adults lie with fever and aches, and sometimes cleanliness coexists with chills and weakness. But in city statistics, which no one would call by that name, the result is clear. Less scabies in wealthy neighborhoods, less facial sores among servants, less corpse odor in summer during processions. Where grooming is enshrined in the charter, dirt becomes an event worthy of complaint. And this is another side of body politics. The authorities teach people to complain not about fate, but about specific service flaws. The soap is not right, the water is too cold, the oil is rancid. The third prepared shift is administrative. Court etiquette becomes a textbook. How to sit, how to hold your hands, how not to smell like the kitchen, how not to leave sweat marks on silk, how to combine modesty and grooming. For everyone, this translates into expenses. Clean linen shirts require washing, oil requires money, and time in the bathhouse requires an hour of life. But these expenses become a sign of loyalty, and loyalty is a ticket to the career ladder. Therefore, resistance does not disappear, but changes form. Instead of banning baths, the ascetic demands a ban on odors. Instead of general swearing, the preacher proposes stricter hours for women. The craftsman asks for a reduction in duties on modest fabrics, arguing that they serve morality. And in each such dispute, the same thing can be heard. Hygiene is power, and power divides the city into those who are accepted and those who are rejected. At the everyday level, the new fashion seems quiet, almost innocent. Markets sell combs and small scissors for mustaches, powders made from crushed salt and herbs, and bags of fragrant clay. Signs with schedules and prices hang near the baths. A handkerchief, stained with rose water, dries on a nail at the barber's. The streets smell less often of rancid fat. Oils are filtered better, because otherwise the sellers themselves would suffocate. But beneath this smooth surface lies harsh mathematics. A clean appearance costs money and time, which means it reinforces differences. Those who can wash according to the courtyard schedule smell and look different. Those for whom the hammam is far away and expensive are left with a lake in their palms and a piece of bread instead of a sponge. The city responds to this gap in its own way. It introduces a fixed price for bath hours for all adults, restricts expensive fragrances in public rooms, and forces bath owners to keep a supply of clean towels for the poor on Saturdays. This never works completely, but it changes the tone on the street. Instead of cursing looseness, people curse schedule violations and dirty water. This is where the axis of myth versus paper is revealed. The myth for the outside observer is simple. The East is supposedly synonymous with sensuality, and grooming is a mask for debauchery. Paper is boring for the city scribe. Bath times, duty rates, a list of acceptable oils for receptions, bans on strong smells in temple quarters, a protocol for punishments for counterfeiting perfumes. The myth promises salvation through strictness. The document provides order through procedure. And if you ask why this topic sounds so gloomy, the answer lies not in fragrances, but in the body. The body of an adult in the 9th century is a vulnerable system. Heat, cold, dirty water, infections, ulcers, smallpox, overheating, dehydration. The politics of grooming saves some bodies, leaving others on the edge. Courtly glamour and urban sweat do not mix, but conflict. Some call cleanliness humility before the rules of civilization. Others call it the pursuit of hypocrisy. The finale of this part is not about the victory of taste, but about the tiny victory of bureaucracy. The more lines of the charter are hung on the door of the hammam, the less room there is for cries of sin, and the more for complaints of the water is cold, the oil is bad, the towel is dirty. And it is precisely from this threshold that the next part will begin, when morality will try to regain power over the body through prohibitions, and the city will respond not with words, but with stamps on schedules and tax tablets. The water schedule enters the city not as a fashion, but as a mark of authority. Signs appear at the baths, with hours for the courtyard, for craftsmen, and for other adults. On the doors, empty squares for the seals of the overseers. Inside, a place to check the oils so that there is no rancid smell. People are admitted to the hammam in batches, so as not to turn the steam room into a bazaar, and this changes the voice of the street. Complaints pass from the ears of preachers to the books of the muhtasib. There they record that the water must be hot in the morning, that the floors must be washed with ash and lime, that towels must be boiled every few days. Violations are punished with fines, and repeat violations result in closure. Modesty ceases to be rhetoric and becomes a measure. Covered shoulders and clean hair require specific fuel and labor. Oil for the skin is delivered from the suburbs. Lye for soap is boiled from the ashes of olive branches. Baskets of myrtle and rose leaves are carried to the market before dawn, so that the scents do not burn out by noon. This logistics show that purity has a price that is measured not in compliments, but in coins, firewood, and hands. The court circle takes the next step. Grooming is incorporated into etiquette. Before meals, mandatory washing is introduced. Hands should smell not of the kitchen, but of water with infusions. Hair is trimmed along the forehead so that it does not fall into the eyes, and shirt collars are kept light in color. Barbers made clean-shaven cheeks and neatly trimmed beards fashionable. For women, it was smooth hair without heavy balms, so as not to shine with grease in the hall. This restraint, declared to be modesty, is in fact a new palace code where the body is part of a letter that is read during an audience. Resistance does not disappear. Legal experts remind us that ostentatious concern for smells distracts from true moderation, and merchants swear that simple oils are no worse than palace ones. But economy of language does not stifle the economy. Shops appear in the city where adults can buy tooth powder made from salt and herbs, finely chopped aromatic wood chips, and small clay bottles of thick paste that is rubbed into the hair before drying. Whether this was morally successful is debated on the railings. Whether it was organizational successful can be seen from the income registers and bath schedules. The first thorny issue in this section is seasonality. Grooming is translated into the language of the season. Light fabrics for heat, thick fabrics for cold. In warm weather, washing in the evening to remove street dust. In cold weather, in the morning, so as not to go to bed with wet skin. Summer scents are brighter. Winter scents are softer. It seems like common sense, but behind it lies a new ladder of differences. Those who serve close to the palace can afford two rituals: water and seasonal clothing. Those who live far from the baths heat water in clay jugs and freeze at the door. The city tries to smooth out the gap officially. It sets up discounted hours for poor adults once a week, allows duty-free imports of cheap olive oil for baths on the condition that it is boiled, and requires hammam owners to keep a supply of simple towels. This is a compromise born of accounting, not preaching, and it reflects the dry breath of administration. Let them argue about morals. We will count buckets and coins. The second issue is safety. Dirt easily gets into the water and oils. Barbers cut with knives that were used to sharpen goose feathers yesterday. Cheap balms cause inflammation behind the ears. In the cold, people catch colds on their way home from the steam room. Bath guards record cases of fever, and medical advice boils down to simple measures. Warm your chest. Don't sit on cold stones. Dry your hair with a linen cloth. Don't use rancid mixtures. Deaths from fashion are not made visible. They are buried quickly and without songs, as custom dictates. But during seasonal outbreaks of coughing, those who save on fuel suffer first. And this is the grim part of body politics. Grooming protects the court and those close to it, leaving behind those who wash with water from a jug and dry their hair by a smoky stove. The city sees this indirectly in the rise in coal costs for hospitals and the appearance of cheap woolen capes on charity lists. The third issue is public smell. Around temple quarters, a quiet ban on strong aromas is introduced so as not to mix ritual spaces with the market of smells. Shop owners are fined if smells spread into the street during prayer hours. This decision cuts off accusations of debauchery, translating it into technical terms: not sin, but failure to observe boundaries; not licentiousness, but violation of neighborhood rules. Body politics thus moves the dispute with moralists into the realm of plans and maps. The plans show where smells can be louder, where they can be quieter, and where they are prohibited altogether. Complaints cease to be a general outcry and become a specific matter. The time, place, type of mixture, and name of the owner. The space for demagoguery shrinks, but the power of the scribe grows. Without a record, there is no violation. Without a violation, there is no fine. Without a fine, there is no order. Thus, ethics turns into geometry. And this geometry is a way to keep the city under control. While the upper classes argue with words, the lower classes defend themselves with their hands. In city workshops, they are improving oil filtration, filtering it through cloth, settling it in cool rooms, checking for bubbles on a spoon. Tooth powders are dried on stoves until crisp so they don't get moldy. Hairbrushes are cut more densely so they don't pull the skin. All this is not for luxury, but for practical reasons. If the product is bad, the buyer is mature and demanding. He returns with a complaint to the muhtasib, and the complaint costs money. The system responds to economics faster than to sermons. And this is precisely where the myth that the East is synonymous with debauchery is defeated. No licentiousness likes product returns and fines, but discipline does. The fashion for modesty draws the market in and makes it obedient where the seal sounds. Critics do not back down. They change their angle of attack. Instead of general accusations, they make specific complaints about the excessive softness of towels, too frequent ablutions before meals, and women's watches, which allegedly distract from modesty. The court's response is laid out in the charter. The removal of watches, closed entrances, bans on talking in the steam room, fines for noise. It all sounds dry, but it acts as a shield. The rules override the logic of sin, leaving critics with only the form of thought without leverage. And here we see the result of the second phase of history. Grooming is established not as a taste, but as an order. The order of the roads is demanding and sometimes cruel to the poor. But it is the language of power, spoken by lists, books, and seals. The ending of this part is inevitable and not spectacular. The city did not defeat vice. The city set a schedule. In the hammams, they set hours for the courtyard, crafts, and adult women. In the markets, they regulate the prices of simple oils and prohibit cheap counterfeits. In the neighborhoods, strong smells and ritual silence are spread. In the treasury, a line of income from baths and duties on fragrances is allocated. Grooming has ceased to be a private initiative and has become an element of the city machine. This does not make it more beautiful, but it does make it more honest. Fewer beautiful legends, more inventory books. And while it is still cold in the shadows, and the poor still dry their hair by the hearth, public halls have become cleaner and quieter, and talk of modesty has ceased to be a means of foreign domination, and has become a form of regulation that can be challenged by complaint. History will lead us further to how this system will begin to export its own standard to neighboring cities, and how the first luxury taxes will appear on this standard, not in sermons, but in registers. The standard of cleanliness begins to spread along the roads, along with goods and songs. Merchants take away from Cordoba not only fabrics and medicines, but also instructions. How to dissolve ash for lye. How long to let fragrant waters settle. How to dry towels so they don't smell moldy. Baths with Cordoba schedules appear in neighboring cities. Barbers copy the manner of trimming hair, and small boards with a list of permitted mixtures for public halls hang in shops selling oils. Where there is no courtyard, wealthy homes take on the role of standard-bearers. When receiving guests, they repeat court rituals, washing before meals, a light scent of myrtle on their hands, no kitchen smoke on their clothes. Thus, a foreign fashion becomes the norm of behavior for adults who want to participate in city life without the risk of being left behind. At this stage, a new divide becomes apparent. Those who have access to water and oils gain another way to say, "We are one of you," while those who do not hear a silent rejection. And once again, paper shapes the world. City books feature a line about discounted bath hours, shops have inspection marks, and the Treasury has total duties on imported resins and rare floral waters. Resistance to reform does not disappear, but matures. Some scholars agree with the baths, but demand strict measures for smells and hairstyles. They call it the protection of modesty, but politics seeps into their tone. Who is allowed to be the standard, and who is ordered to learn humility in line? In response, the city changes its approach. Instead of general prohibitions, it introduces licenses and exams. Barbers are required to keep their tools clean. Bathhouses are required to keep a complaint book. And perfume sellers are required to keep a sample for inspection by the mutasib. Violators face fines and temporary closure. For moralizers, this sounds like defeat. They offered the whip of words, but got a stamp on the schedule. For the court, it is a victory of order over noise. For artisans, it is a new ladder, where each rung asks not about the soul, but about safety. There is cruelty in this technique. An adult master is deprived of his earnings for weeks because of rancid balm, and his house is sinking into debt. Such falls are visible in the registers, and they are darker than any sermon. The export of Cordoba's modesty has side effects. An underground market has emerged for strong fragrances that are banned in temple quarters and near the chancellery. They are sold at night in unlabeled bags. The scent lasts longer, but irritates the skin and causes rashes in the heat. Medical records show an increase in inflammation among adults returning from secret appointments, and the city responds not with sermons but with raids. They search for clues not from hearsay, but from stains on fabrics and on the walls of shops. Nearby, control over soap is tightening. Lye is boiled in communal courtyards, and if rot gets into the vat, skin burns are guaranteed. Several cases of scandal when adults come out of the bathhouse with redness and pain are recorded dryly and without details, but they are enough to introduce a norm for trial batches. This does not make the world safe, but it does force a 24-hour waiting period before sale. Supervision turns risk from the norm into the exception, and therein lies the ugly honesty of the system. The second layer of conflict is the language of clothing. The court code dictates not only cleanliness, but also the seasonal measure of colors and fabrics, and cities read this. Modest shades are given an unspoken priority at receptions, while colorful ones are squeezed out on market days. Labels appear in shops saying for receptions, for the street, for the home, and they are not about taste, but about access. Moralists criticize the logic, seeing in it a new ladder of vanity, and they are not mistaken. The ladder is real. But in the urban machine, ladders are the main means of movement. Therefore, in parallel with the royal palette, a rule is established for the streets. One set of colors for mourning, another for holidays, and a third for temple quarters. This eliminates disputes on the spot and takes the conflict to where the scribes and guards decide. In this translation of feelings onto paper, we can hear what makes this story disturbing. Purity and modesty become infrastructure, and infrastructure does not ask about the soul. The third layer is the kitchen and breathing. The ban on strong kitchen smells in reception rooms leads to changes in everyday life. Palace servants are forbidden to cook roasts near the audience chambers. Markets introduce a rule to wrap fatty foods so that they do not saturate the air. Spice shops are restricted from grinding mixtures so that dust does not penetrate neighboring rooms. The guards do not catch looseness, they catch particles. This seems ridiculous only until the first attack of suffocation in an adult with chronic hoarseness. After a couple of tragic incidents in which people collapsed in the middle of a crowded hall, the city cantons send out a circular where grinding is allowed, where frying is allowed, where a water jug must be kept. And once again, morality gives way to sanitation. It's not sin, it's dust. It's not shame, it's grease in the air. For some, this sounds like a victory of reason. For others, a victory of taste over the poor, for whom the kitchen is the only warm room. At the same time, lessons in civility flourish. Adults striving to climb the social ladder pay barbers and tutors for training in proper behavior. They are taught not to look toward the hearth, to wipe their hands with infused water before shaking hands, not to leave greasy marks on fabric, and to change their hats according to the season. The lessons are expensive and paid for with time. Those who cannot afford them are given away by the city. A rough beard, smoke-smelling hair, scratches from a coarse brush. There is no justice in this, nor will there ever be. And this is where the doctrine of modesty shows its teeth. It is as fair as order and as unfair as a ladder. Paper does not record equality, but guidelines. At the courtyard level, grooming becomes a password system. A clean face, a soft smell, and no kitchen stains on clothes are signs that a person has come on business and understands the rules. This makes life easier for officials who are required to weed out random petitioners and complicates life for those who live by the labor of their hands. The city is trying to soften the blow. It is introducing free public wash basins in some neighborhoods, distributing simple tooth powder in hospitals, and requiring bathhouses to give towels to poor adults on Saturdays. These measures do not change the latter, but they create cracks through which human dignity can squeeze through. People feel this in their bones. Fewer random humiliations at the entrance to the place where destinies are decided. Fewer reasons for shame at the door. The most evil thing about this system is its ability to outlive those who invented it. Names will disappear, but signs, lists, and duties will remain. Hammams will operate on schedule. Barbers will pass inspections. Shops will keep samples, and muktasibs will count fines. This means that Cordoba's modesty will survive as a useful part of the city machine, honed to the real needs of the body and the authorities. In legend, this will be called the victory of taste over vice. In the document, it will be called income stabilization and a reduction in street stench. For living people, it will be simpler, less scabies and festering sores for those who wash and dry their hair, more fatigue for those who pay for cleaning. And where the myth continues to say, the East is synonymous with debauchery, the paper will neatly lay out the cornerstones: bath time, smell measurement, oil prices, and suggest looking at the city as an organism in which grooming is not a sin or a decoration, but a way to stay healthy and not stink when meeting with the authorities. Then the following will happen. The first special fees for excessive luxuries will appear in the registers, and the debate will finally move from sermons to accounting. The climax comes more quietly than the moralizers expected. Instead of a loud ban on smells and hairstyles, the city puts new rates on the table, an increased duty on imported resins, and, conversely, a reduced duty on simple oils for baths so as not to alienate poor adults from water. The statutes of the hammams are rewritten so that the same rules apply in every quarter: hours for the courtyard, hours for crafts, hours for adult women, the requirement to boil towels at specified intervals, a ban on loud conversations and music, a separate provision for the weak and sick, who are allowed to stay longer. The muktasibs are given the additional duty of checking not piety, but technique, the cleanliness of barbers' knives, the transparency of infusions, the temperature of the water. The wave of complaints that previously went to the preachers now flows into the books of the chancelleries. Now looseness has been replaced by a line about a fine for rancid balm or for a wet floor in the changing room. Thus, modesty is turned into an administrative norm, not a train of thought, but the geometry of schedules and columns in consumables. In response to resistance, the city makes another move, the most cruel in its dryness. It introduces a luxury tax. Where scents and fabrics exceed the limits of public moderation, an additional fee is imposed. In practice, this looks like a simple table on the doors of the tax office. So much for rare resins, so much for paints, brighter than those allowed in the halls, so much for decorated combs made of rare wood, if they are intended for receptions. The official formula explains the tax as restraining excess for the sake of order. But the unofficial meaning is clear without words. Shift the desire to stand out to the wallet. Work out the conflict at the cash register, not in the square. After such measures, the street atmosphere becomes a little calmer. There are fewer arguments on street corners, and more chatter in queues at bathhouses and shops. The courtiers call it civilization, the craftsmen call it order, and those who live from day to day simply call it a new tribute to time and water. However, the administrative world does not cancel out the human one. In winter, people still fall from the cold in the hammams, if they have frozen on the way home and cannot find anywhere to warm up. In summer, their skin burns from cheap additives if they did not have enough money for a good infusion. Shops cheat by diluting rosewater, and then a rash appears on the cheeks, and the throat stings from cheap powder. These facts are not found in legends, but in hospital lists, where the cost of medicines for skin inflammation and cough syrup is marked under a separate line. Sometimes, city charity prescribes free admission to the bathhouse once a week for poor adults, and this saves them more in the cold than all the sermons. Sometimes, on the contrary, a new duty on imported oils destroys someone's meager income, and a person who clung to a clean appearance as if it were a lifeline falls into the gray waters of a lice-infested existence. Body politics, even when it becomes paper politics, does not cease to be a struggle for breath. In this struggle, the decisions of individual adults, on whom the outcome depends, can be heard. At the door of the hammam, a gatekeeper with frost-bitten hands, who knows that the water is barely warm at night, allows a woman weaver, who has come from the markets to stay longer than the sign says, and turns a blind eye to the hourglass. The barber, whose knives are already old, does not allow a customer with an infection behind his ear into the barber's chair, even though he needed the money, and sends him to the hospital because he understands the price of someone else's suffering during the cold season. The oil merchant refuses to give a discount on the rancid leftovers to a familiar servant, even though he promises to keep quiet, and takes the bottle to the muhtasib, so as to be held accountable publicly rather than bring shame on his shop. A clerk in the office, who is tasked with transferring the norms from the palace list to the city charter, writes in a clause about free towels in cold weather as mandatory, not recommended, understanding that someone's life depends on it, not their reputation. These decisions will not change the table of duties, but they change the atmosphere around the numbers. Fakirs and preachers, whose power lies in their loud words, move away from open accusations and switch to selective jabs. They strike not at water, but at gloss, not according to schedule, but according to the heart. The city responds with a simple answer, one it has become accustomed to over the years. The heart is not a matter of record here, but health is. Smells are not a decline in morals, but a tool for coexistence in the hall. Modesty is not ashes on the head, but the absence of ostentatious display. A short formula is added to the charter, which is not discussed for hours, but simply followed. Let the smell follow the person, not go ahead of them or remain behind them. This measure is technical, like the depth of a washing bowl, but it is precisely this that ends the debate, translating morality into a layer of physical quantities. In fact, the city recognizes that modesty is the silence of signs, not ostentatious poverty. By the end of this journey, Cordoba looks different. The treasury contains neat lines of income from baths and duties on fragrances. The charter contains maps with zones of silence and scent. The shops contain samples with the seals of the muhtasib. At the bathhouse doors, lists of hours for different categories of adults. At the barbers, worn but clean knives. In the cemeteries, graves are still dug too early and too often, because no order can abolish fever and poverty. But the mortuaries smell less in summer, and that is also a result. The myth that the East is synonymous with debauchery is dying in this city, not in debate, but in accounting. It is drowned out by the sound of quills on parchment and the quiet hiss of steam in stone halls. The court protects civilization as a discipline. The city enforces bathhouse hours and luxury taxes. The market learns to filter oils. The poor gain access to water, albeit narrow corridors. This is not a fairy tale, but a dry balance of survival. In such a denouement, human decision remains the last measure of meaning. Do not demand demonstrations from the body that it cannot withstand. Do not confuse grooming with privilege where it is a sanitary necessity. Do not allow preaching to supplant complaint and complaint to slide into empty abuse. Those who took this measure left traces: an extra step at the wash basin in the poor quarter, a supply of warm towels on cold days, a note about free admission on Saturdays, a returned fine for an honest sample in a perfume shop. They embody the ultimate logic of this story: cleanliness as a common language, modesty as the absence of violence in smell and gaze, grooming as a sign of respect for the breath of others. And where the legend still tries to call all this debauchery, there is a document that clearly shows that the city chose not shame and disgrace, but procedure. And it was precisely procedure, with its boring seals and clumsy signs, that gave adults a chance to live side by side without suffocating each other and without paying for someone else's fashion with their own blood. The latest twist in the dispute makes the city even more dry and precise. Brief instructions on public moderation are added to the bath schedules and duty registers, in which grooming is separated from dandyism and hidden in the techniques of communal living. It states that adults should enter the hall without the smell of cooking and without sticky mixtures in their hair, that hands should be clean and dry before shaking hands, that strong scents are appropriate not in public, but in private after washing. This sparse vocabulary, created by officials and barbers, does not sound beautiful, but it works. There are fewer complaints, conversations are shorter, and responsibility is more concrete. And the drier the document, the quieter the myth. The legends about the looseness of the East do not hold up well in places where there is order in the use of water, light, towels, and knives. Social protection is quietly taking shape, not out of charity but out of calculation. In neighborhoods with bathhouses, they are required to keep the wash basins outside in the heat and release steam in small portions in the winter so that no one collapses when they go out into the cold. Barbers are fined for cuts and burns, but are allowed to write off half the fine if the adult victim received free care in the hospital. Perfume shops are offered a reduced fee on the condition that on certain days they distribute plain infused water to those who have no money. This does not eliminate the ladder of differences, but it does save some people from falling off the edge. In summer, there are fewer fainting spells at the gates of the hammams. In winter, there is less coughing in the queues of beggars. In hospitals, there is more clean linen. Paradoxically, it is taxes that save some of the poor. They pay for firewood and towels for all adults during the cold weeks. No one prays for this, it is simply calculated. Meanwhile, the standard of modesty, as invisible silence, is penetrating where price and class noise once reigned supreme. Colorful paints are no longer tolerated in reception rooms, not out of contempt for poverty, but out of respect for the breathing of others. Markets introduce a sober rule to wrap pungent products so that the smell does not make the street unbearable. A map of weak aromas is established around temple quarters, and on holidays, windows are aired out on a schedule. All this makes the world not softer, but more predictable. Predictability turns out to be the best form of modesty. Where everyone knows when to wash, when to smell, and when to keep their nose quiet, there is less humiliation and fewer accidental collisions, in which the person with the thinner wallet is always to blame. Some scholars, who until recently denounced grooming as a mask of debauchery, are now joining the camp of sanitary sobriety. They are taking on the language of compromise. How many hours is it permissible to keep the water hot so as not to deprive the neighborhood of fuel? What level of smell is considered decent for the audience so as not to interfere with the word? Where to place wash basins so as not to turn staircases into puddles? This alliance is unexpected and therefore important. Instead of rhetoric about punishment, theological notes now contain dry reservations about physical measures. It would seem to be a victory for the court. In reality, it is a victory for the city, which has managed to translate moral concerns into tables and maps, thereby removing some of the unnecessary shame from the body. The myth is deprived of its stage when it is pulled into a filing cabinet. The economy is the first to adapt. Gill marks appear among barbers and soap makers. Who has the right to serve receptions? Who has the right to serve baths for all adults? Who has the right to make only tooth powders? Samples with the muhtasib's seal hang in perfume shops. Towel suppliers display certificates of boiling, indicating the day and hour. Any violation is now not a reason for a sermon, but a reason for punishment. The severity is not hidden. Adult craftsmen lose their livelihood for a rancid mixture or a dirty knife. But along with the strictness, professional pride is growing. Where they used to be proud of the brightness of the smell, now they are proud of the silence, the ability to smell unnoticed, the cleanliness of the knives, the ability not to burn or cut. This is the new honor, in which there is less hypocrisy than in any ostentatious asceticism. Honor not in words, but in deeds. Body politics always casts shadows. In the suburbs, water is still scarce, and adults wash themselves in jugs. In cheap courtyards, towels are dried over smoke, which makes them smell of soot. In the heat, some people save on oil, rubbing their hair with whatever they can find, and then they get a rash. The city does not pretend that these shadows do not exist. It simply learns not to lie, calling dirt a sin and cleanliness debauchery. For neglected neighborhoods, they prescribe open water days when people can wash for free. For crafts, cheap lots of simple soap. For shops, strict inspection of infusions during the warm months. In this sobriety, the city is more frightening than any sermon, because it recognizes bodies as vulnerable and chooses routine over shame. There are many routines: boiling, airing, keeping quiet, filtering, settling, drying. And it is precisely this routine that holds what no myth can hold: life nearby. On distant roads, the name of the fashionista fades, but the rule itself lives on. In neighboring capitals based on borrowed lists, quiet zones are introduced around offices and temples. Bathhouse schedules are copied. Similar fees are charged for extra resin, and free towels are prescribed for poor adults. In some places, these measures turn into a club. They fine more than they help, and then modesty again becomes a foreign staff. But in places where officials know how to count not only money but also breath, the result is the same: less stench, fewer skin infections, fewer tears at the entrance, where someone was turned away because of an indecent smell. The difference between legend and chronicle here is simple. Legend looks for someone to blame. Chronicle looks for the temperature of the water. The final twist is human. It is not rulers or moralists who decide the outcome, but unsung people who make choices every day. The gatekeeper who delays closing the bathhouse for a few minutes, for those who have run from the market. The barber who spends an extra hour boiling his instruments, even though no one will see. The shopkeeper who does not dilute the infused water, understanding the price of someone else's skin. The scribe who writes a small clause into the charter about the right of a weak adult to an extra minute of warmth without punishment. These decisions are neither victorious nor beautiful, but they constitute what was called civilization when they wanted to praise the court, and modesty when they wanted to tame the tongue. In reality, it is the same ability to care for someone else's breath without crippling your own. The result is audible without fanfare. The myth that the East is synonymous with debauchery crumbles to dust at the threshold of the hammam, where the smell of warm water, ash, and myrtle fills the air, and a sign with hours and fines hangs on the wall. The document keeps the city from shouting, forcing it to speak in numbers. So many hours of hot water, So many of silence, so many of tax on excess, so many of free towels in the cold. Dirt does not disappear, but it ceases to be the norm. Grooming does not become a luxury, but remains a discipline. Modesty refuses to play the role of a club and becomes quieter, like a light trace of cleanliness that does not precede a person or trail behind them. The most important thing in this outcome is the choice of the living. They accepted rules that do not humiliate and rejected shameful rhetoric that does not wash anything away. This means that body politics has become what it should be in difficult times. Not a pose or a dance of taste, but a craft of survival that can be tested with a hand on a towel, skin in a steam room, and breath in a common room, where it is now possible to be together.